Good morning, everyone. For those who may not know, I'm Al Green, and it's my preeminent privilege to serve as the chairperson of the Oversight Committee. We have not officially called the meeting to order, the hearing to order, and I have not done so because I'd like to make a few comments before we actually start our first hearing of this session of Congress. I'm honored to be seated, of course, next to our ranking member, Mr. Barr. He will make a few comments after I've made my comments. I'd like to thank Mr. Barr for his willingness to work with me. He and I have had lunch together, and we've discussed some of the issues that are of importance to us and to the American people. This is not to say that we'll always agree, but it is to say that we will keep the lines of communication open so that we can talk to each other about these issues as they develop. I'm also very appreciative of Ms. Wagner. She's not here, but sometimes what you say behind a person's back can be more important than what you say in the presence. And behind her back, in her absence, I'd like to thank her for initiating the effort to bring this bill to fruition. Obviously, it's something that we picked up from a hearing that we had, but she broached the issue initially and called it to my attention. We started on this in the last Congress. It was the Wagner-Green bill then. In this Congress, it's the Green-Wagner bill, but by any name, it's an important piece of legislation that will benefit the people of this country, and Ms. Wagner should be given an enormous amount of credit for calling it to our attention. I also want to thank the chairperson of the full committee. This is a great opportunity for us to present some issues and hopefully resolve some concerns. Getting things before the public when you have as many issues as we have in financial services can be a challenge. And the chairperson has permitted us to move forward with this hearing, for which I'm greatly appreciative. Also like to thank Mr. McHenry, who is a member of the full committee. He and I have worked together on projects in the past and look forward to working with him as well.
Well, will the chairman yield for a
Chair
question?
yields to Mr. McHenry.
Chairman Green, we've worked together. You were previously ranking member when I was chairman of the Oversight Subcommittee a couple Congresses back. If this is because we have, if this sort of tactic to start the hearing without starting the hearing, if it's because we have more members on the Republican side than the Democrat side, I'd give the chairman assurances that it's not our intention to adjourn. We agree that this is an important subject matter. There's bipartisan support for us fixing this program, and I would just kindly announce that we have no intention of motioning to adjourn because we have more members present than the Democrat side of the aisle, and I would welcome the start of the hearing if that is the chairman's choice and decision. But thank you for your leadership and the relationship that we've had over the years and open engagement. I yield back.
Well, thank you. Actually, you can be very proud of your ranking member. He already addressed the concern that you raised, and the purpose of this, quite candidly, is to do something that we rarely do, and that is to build a degree of collegiality that's important for us to move forward. So I appreciate your commentary, and I, before embarking upon this, got the consent of your ranking member to do so. At which point now I shall yield to the ranking member. And Mr. Ranking Member, if you would, Mr. Barr.
Thank you, Chairman Green, and I'll be brief. Thank you to you for our lunch and for getting off on a great start, working in a new subcommittee for me. I returned to this subcommittee from my first term in Congress, but I very much look forward to the opportunity to work on this subcommittee. Oversight is a critical function for the Congress, and although congressional oversight authorities are broad, they are not unlimited, and they certainly need to be connected to legitimate legislative purposes. Today's oversight hearing is a great example of that. There's a very legitimate legislative purpose to ensuring that taxpayers are protected and that victims of disasters receive the assistance that they need in an expeditious manner. I want to thank Also, Ranking Member McHenry and the members on this side of the aisle for having the confidence in me to lead this side of the committee. And with that, I will turn it back over to Chairman Green and look forward to today's hearing.
Thank you, Mr. Ranking Member. I greatly appreciate your kind words and do look forward to working with you. At this point, we will call the meeting, the hearing, if you will, to order. This hearing is styled the Administration of Disaster Recovery Funds in the wake of Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. And while this is the style of the hearing, I would mention to you that this could easily be about all of the various hurricanes and natural disasters, including wildfires, tornadic activity that we have had through the years. This hearing is taking place because we believe that when you have it within your power to solve a problem and you do not do so, you can become the problem. We clearly have it within our power, we, the Congress of the United States, to solve a problem that is plaguing the American people from coast to coast. And what is this problem? It is our failure to codify and standardize the CDBG DR program. Quite candidly, there is no standardized program in place. And as a result of not having codification and standardization, we find ourselves with many things happening. When we have a natural disaster, we find that there's a lot of finger pointing. It starts at the top with HUD and OMB having to come together to come to conclusions as to what the rules of the road will be as it relates to a given natural disaster. And this is done after each and every natural disaster. We start all over again. It really is time for us to stop the reinventing and to give us a program that we can rely upon. After HUD and OMB finally come to some agreement as to what the rules of the road will be, they then have to pass these on to the grantees. In the interim, the grantees and the people that they serve are suffering. We need to make sure that money gets to these various entities that are to dispose of them properly in a timely fashion. In Texas, we still have not received all of the resources that are available to us from the last hurricane, Harvey. Actually, it was a storm that took many lives. Over those 3 years, we had hurricanes that cost us about $182.3 billion, and 85 lives were lost. And these were hurricanes and natural disasters that occurred prior to 2018. So it's important for us to not overly complicate this issue and for us to seek solutions. This bill that we have, the Green-Wagner bill, would codify and standardize the CDBG-DR program. It would give the large metropolitan areas a possibility of receiving direct funding and give smaller areas a better understanding of how they can access resources. My hope is that we will continue to have the bipartisanship that we have shown thus far and that we will get this bill passed as quickly as possible. I now yield 5 minutes to the ranking member.
Thank you, Chairman Green, and I am going to yield a minute of my time to the former chairwoman of this subcommittee, Ann Wagner, the author, along with you, of the legislation that is the subject of today's hearing. But again, thank you for holding this important hearing. Today, we will hear from a wide variety of witnesses, including state grantees, a former HUD administrator for the program, and the counsel to the Inspector General, who has been involved in many investigations and audits of the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program. We will also hear from our colleagues, Chairman Green and Congresswoman Wagner, on their working draft of a bill to codify the CDBG-DR program. The bill seeks to balance our shared interest in quickly getting money to the people who are recovering from natural disasters and the need for oversight of the distribution of billions of dollars in disaster relief. When disaster strikes, it is important that help comes quickly and that communities have a clear understanding of where to turn and how to access CDBG-DR funds. The CDBG-DR program is one of several ways Congress and the federal government assist the local recovery process. Specifically, the program is designed to address unmet needs in our most vulnerable communities to help low and moderate income people and small businesses recover fully from the most severe natural disasters. Congress first appropriated CDBG-DR funds in 1993 to help with recovery efforts following Hurricane Andrew. Since then, Congress has appropriated $87 billion in supplemental funds for CDBG-DR. Recently, the supplemental appropriations for disaster relief exceed the annual appropriation for HUD's Community Development Block Grant Program. There are too many dollars at stake to manage this program on an ad hoc basis. One of our best allies in the effort to make sure disaster recovery money is spent efficiently and effectively is the HUD Office of Inspector General. The HUD OIG has spent years conducting audits and investigations of the CDBG-DR program and advocating for codification of the program. We're grateful for that work, and I look forward to hearing testimony from Mr. Kirkland about the OIG's findings. Every time Congress passes another supplemental appropriation for CDBG-DR, HUD uses CDBG program staff to administer and oversee the distribution of the funding. This program is too transitory. With no permanent infrastructure, there's a higher chance of waste, fraud, and abuse. I understand that no disaster is the same, and it's important that the affected communities are able to put this money to best use. But it is crucial for the program to have the proper controls in place. We must ensure that money is spent for recovery efforts and that the action plans approved by HUD are followed. There are so many stories about grantees using disaster recovery money for purposes outside of the scope of the action plan approved by HUD. For example, Louisiana is unable to account for nearly $700 million meant to be used to elevate homes in a flood zone. In another Louisiana case, $10 million allocated for housing purposes was used to build a new wing on the local World War II museum. Mississippi used recovery funds to build roads and plumbing infrastructure in an area where no one lives. New York and New Jersey pooled unused disaster recovery money into a slush fund. This is not how the program is meant to work. HUD's disaster recovery program is supposed to help rebuild homes and infrastructure damaged by a natural disaster and provide assistance to affected business owners with an emphasis on helping low and moderate income areas. But those requirements are often waived and money winds up being used for other purposes. It's my hope that through today's hearing, we can better understand how to maintain the flexibility needed at the local level to apply disaster recovery money to unmet needs while increasing oversight of the program. I applaud my colleagues for their bipartisan effort, and I want to thank the HUD OIG for its work to identify vulnerabilities in this important program. Communities affected by natural disasters need our help, and they're counting on us to get this right. And with that, I will now yield 1 minute to the gentlelady from Missouri, Mrs. Wagner.
I thank the ranking member, my friend Andy Barr, from who is the ranking member of the Oversight and Investigation Committee, for yielding time. And Mr. Chairman, I want to thank you. You have been a great partner in this endeavor, and I appreciate your willingness to work with me to make sure disaster relief is being spent on the victims of natural disasters who need assistance. When a natural disaster strikes, the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program helps rebuild our communities. These relief funds provide essential emergency aid and jumpstart the recovery process for those most in need. Last Congress, the Subcommittee on Oversight and Investigation began a bipartisan effort examining ways to improve the CDBG-DR program. Mr. Chairman, I am proud to say that today's legislation is a product of that work, and I look forward to working with you again this Congress to codify the CDBG-DR program. With that, I yield back.
Thank you. I will now yield time to the chair of the full committee, the gentlelady from California, Ms. Waters.
Thank you very much, Chairman Green. I want to start by saying congratulations to you on convening your first hearing and want to thank the witnesses for being here today. Mr. Chairman, many of our communities continue to struggle following the destruction of Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria, the wildfires in California and the West, and numerous other natural disasters across America. I'm deeply concerned that 2 years after these disasters struck and more than a year after Congress appropriated funding, not one penny has gone to the victims. The CDBG disaster recovery funding process is in desperate need of reform. It is also important for us to be diligent in our oversight of the federal programs that aid recovery efforts. Historically, we've seen troubling inequality in how the federal government responds to natural disasters. The Government Accountability Office reported that federal disaster assistance has primarily benefited wealthier homeowners at the expense of lower-income renters. When the government does not prioritize the rebuilding of affordable rental housing, it pushes out low-income residents that once lived in those areas, which can deepen segregation in our neighborhoods. We're also aware of racial inequalities in the distribution of funding, as took place with Louisiana's Road Home Program. And I think about that. I'm very much aware of what happened there. These well-documented inequalities are precisely why this committee must ensure that our ongoing and future disaster recovery efforts are fair, transparent, efficient, and consistent. So I'm looking forward to hearing from our witnesses today about how we can improve our response in the aftermath of disasters. Thank you, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to, without objection, submit my entire opening statement for the record. I'd like to also submit for the record a statement from HUD concerning this disaster relief, which codifies what you've said, Mr. Chairman, in terms of their encouraging us to take affirmative action. Also like to submit for the record, without objection, a chart that will give some indication as to amount of time it takes for the resources to be agreed upon and get to the various grantees, all without objection. And moving forward, would like to welcome the witnesses who are appearing today. Want to thank you for being here. We have with us today Mr. Fernando Gil Edsignat. He is a Secretary of Housing for Puerto Rico. Had the preeminent privilege of visiting your country, or our country, just recently. Also, we have with us Ms. Daphne Lamel. She is the Executive Director of Housing for Harris County Community Services in Texas, in Houston, I might add. Also with us, we have Mr. Jeremy Kirkland. He is the Counsel to the Inspector General at the Department of Housing and Urban Development. And representing Enterprise Community Partners is its Vice President, Marion Mulligan McFadden. Welcome to all of the witnesses. I want to thank you again. You will each have 5 minutes to make your opening statements, and without objections, any written statements that the witnesses will have will be made a part of the record. Once the witnesses have finished presenting their testimony, each member of the subcommittee will have 5 minutes within which to ask questions of the witnesses. I'll remind the witnesses that while you're not under oath, you are subject to 18 U.S.C. Section 1001, which makes it a crime to knowingly give a false statement in a proceeding such as this one. You have lights before you, and you will note that the 3 lights are there for a reason. The green light indicates that you should start your testimony. The yellow light indicates that you will have 1 minute left. And then, of course, there is a red light, which means that you are out of time. Microphones are quite sensitive, but I do encourage you to pull them closer to you than they are currently when you decide that you are going to give your actual statements. Mr. Edsignat, you are now recognized for 5 minutes to make your opening statement.
Chairman Green, Ranking Member Barr, members of the committee, thank you very much for the invitation to appear before you today regarding the administration of disaster recovery funds in the wake of Hurricanes Harvey, Irma, and Maria. One of the greatest lessons my parents taught me is the virtue of being grateful. And I would like to take the opportunity to personally thank you for all the overwhelming support that Congress has shown to Puerto Rico after the impacts of Hurricane Maria and Irma. The proactive approach taken by our resident Commissioner Gonzalez Colon and Governor Rosselló set the pace for a swift congressional action in the wake of the devastation of these storms to appropriate resources for our recovery. The support has been bipartisan and is a symbol of the U.S. citizens of how can we come together in times of need, putting aside our difference and acting for the good of all members in this great nation. On behalf of the 3.2 million U.S. citizens who live in Puerto Rico, I thank you. I would also like to thank our partners in HUD, from Secretary Carson, Assistant Secretary Wall, CFO Irv Dennis, the respective staff, and all the people that work in HUD for their support that they have given us to enhance our recovery strategies and drive us to enhance our capabilities. My most sincere appreciation to Mr. Neil Parker, and who has been working with us since day one, and to especially to my agency, the Department of Housing in Puerto Rico, and all my coworkers there, to Governor Rosselló and my family that has shown unconditional support. Mr. Chairman, it has not been an easy road for us. The devastation wrought to Puerto Rico by these hurricanes was immense, but as terrible as those storms were, the recovery has been equally as grueling. As Secretary of the Puerto Rico Department of Housing, I oversee over $500 million in federal funding and manage the second largest public housing authority in the nation, as well as many other HUD programs. As familiar as I can be with HUD statutes, regulations, and policies and other federal funding programs, CDBG-DR, a program which changes from disaster appropriation to appropriation, is in a class of its own. We're very fortunate to find contractors that help us to guide through the maze and help us translate our vision in actionable plans. From the moments the dollars were appropriated, even before the HUD allocation, we sprung into action, working on preparing a myriad of required documents, and then solicited comments from stakeholders and executing a comprehensive citizen participation plan. In all, we have been allocated almost $20 billion from September 2017 appropriation bill and February 2018 bill. Since CDBG-DR is not an authorized program, the regulations stem from the language of each appropriation act and can be at the mercy of the policy preference of the political leadership at the time. This has meant multiple federal registers, notice, and action plans workflows. In our case, because of the new leadership, some programs approved in July 2018 were reversed in March 2019. Our first amendment to the action plan has been approved, but we are currently waiting for a grant agreement from HUD so we can access the next tranche of $8.2 billion. This amendment included 9 new programs plus the previously 19 programs previously approved in the areas of economic development, housing, infrastructure, and planning. Each of our tranches of recovery funding will come from a unique grant agreement. We are hopeful that since our initial action plan and first amendment are substantially similar, it won't take HUD that long to send us the agreement and that version to be a current executive agreement. In that sense, I'm fully supportive of any efforts to make disaster recovery easier and having authorized programs and process in place that will help that cause, but I have some concerns. Flexibility is one of the greatest aspects of CDBG-DR, and understandably, with flexibility, complexity shouldn't be bound to it. However, just because monitoring a complex program is hard does not mean we should remove the flexibility that allows grantees to meet unique present recovery needs on our jurisdiction. Regarding HUD to determine what is equitable distribution between activities and geographic distribution for a grantee based on FEMA and SBA data is based on an assumption that FEMA and SBA have the correct data. According to available data, as September 2018, FEMA registered over 1.1 million applicants in Puerto Rico. However, the data reveals that only less than 217,000 were approved for housing repairs and replace assistance. Removing grantee ability to reclassify eligible projects and as the recovery matures and evolves removes maximum deference. I got another all things to say, Mr. Chairman, but I believe that standardization and the expertise between the recovery framework should be one thing that led to a better codification of this law. And again, thank you for inviting me to appear before you today, and thank you for your continued partnership as we seek not just to recover from the horrific storms, but to transform the future of Puerto Rico and the 3.2 million U.S. citizens who live on the island under disparate treatment due to our non-inclusive territorial status. Thank you.
Thank you for using your time efficaciously. You set a good example for the rest of us. Let's move now to Ms. Lamel. You're recognized for 5 minutes.
Good morning, Chairman Green, Ranking Member Barr, members of the subcommittee. As Executive Director of the Harris County Community Services Department, I serve in the capacity of Administrator of the county's Community Development Block Grant Program for both the county's entitlement program and the disaster recovery activities. Thank you for the opportunity to provide information on recovery efforts and activities in Harris County following the aftermath of Hurricane Harvey, specifically related to the local perspective in carrying out CDBG-DR activities. First, I want to express my gratitude to the committee for holding this hearing and for the work that has been done to ensure that our residents, disaster relief to our residents who are still in recovery are flowing to them. For context, it's important to understand the county's makeup. Harris County, Texas is the third populous county in the United States. It's home to the City of Houston, Texas Medical Center, Port of Houston, NASA Johnson Space Center, one of the largest petrochemical industry clusters in the country. By the end of last year, Harris County had a total population of 4.8 million persons. One unique aspect of the county is that nearly half of the population resides in unincorporated areas of the county, and if incorporated, would make up the second largest city in Texas and the fifth largest city in the country. Understandably, Hurricane Harvey impacted this population. It dumped more than 1 trillion gallons of water on the county for a 4-day period, covered Harris County's 1,778 square miles with an average of 33 inches of water. Per FEMA individual assistance data, 160,000 households applied for assistance, with only a little more than 53% of those receiving any kind of immediate relief following the storm. Harris County has also been impacted by 6 presidentially declared disasters in the last 10 years. In 2015 and 2016, we saw 4 major flood disasters. The cumulative impact of these disasters with Hurricane Harvey has been devastating to local residents, businesses, and institutions. Recovery from one disaster has been exacerbated by those floods that followed. CDBG-DR is a critical relief program for our community. Harris County has suffered from significant natural disasters, and without CDBG-DR, we would not be able to rebuild and recover appropriately. Most recently, we did a Hurricane I recovery program following the 2008 storm. CDBG-DR was critical to help our residents and also stand up a local infrastructure recovery program. For Hurricane Harvey, Harris County is utilizing $1.2 billion allocation in CDBG-DR from the state of Texas to again stand up recovery programs that will aid in the buyout, rebuilding, replacement of housing, and implementation of local drainage improvement systems. At this point, my testimony will focus on our local perspective as a subgrantee of the state. While CDBG-DR has been an effective funding source and program assisting Harris County in its recovery, the process by which the county has received its funds has often been fraught with delays and other impediments to efficient recovery. Delays have occurred because Harris County is not a direct grantee, but is a subgrantee of the state, and the nature of subgranting inherently adds time to the implementation of recovery programs. While Harris County did experience some improvement in reduction of time with Harvey when compared to prior disasters, the processing time is still far too long. Harris County executed its contract for $909 million of its $1.2 billion in CDBG-DR funds with the state of Texas on January 29, 2019, 17 months post-storm. As a subgrantee, Harris County had to await the state's publication of its plan. Following approval of the state's plan, we had to await approval of our local plan. While the county has steadfastly developed its recovery activities and preparing its local plan, the subgrantee process delayed distribution of needed recovery resources. As a direct grantee, Harris County may submit its plan, receive its grant agreement directly from HUD, removing the estimated time frame in receipt of funds. Harris County is a HUD entitlement community and has capacity to implement its own programs. Lastly, program flexibility. CDBG-DR is a very flexible program, but it is important to recognize and understand that the local control and recovery plan is driven by its residents. Harris County CDBG-DR recovery programs become an extension of the state's plan and at times may conflict with the state's plan, which adds more time to delivery. In closing, I would just add that I do support the codification and permanent authorization of the CDBG-DR program. It would mean a speeding up of the time for receipt of funds. And any reform to CDBG-DR, consider the facts that I've provided today and my written testimony. Again, I appreciate the opportunity to appear here before the committee, and thank you for your support, and I'll take any questions.
Thank you very much. You two have utilized your time wisely. Thank you. Moving now to our next witness, who will be recognized for 5 minutes. This will be Mr. Kirkland.
Good morning, Chairman Green, Ranking Member Barr, Chairwoman Waters, and members of the subcommittee. I am Jeremy Kirkland, Counsel to the Inspector General of the Department of Housing and Urban Development. It is a pleasure to be here with you today to talk about our work in disaster recovery oversight. I could not be more proud of our staff and their work in this important area. Since 2002, we have issued 119 audits, 7 evaluations reports, and have opened more than 600 investigations on this topic. Throughout our work, we have noticed recurring themes, including the need for codification, the need for model programs that provide clear, consistent expectations for strong internal controls, and the need for accountability for and expenditure of funds at late stages in the process. And we know that mitigation of future disasters is important for this accountability. We believe the CDBG-DR's mission is an important one that is so important that we believe that it should be codified into its own program within HUD. One thing we know, disasters aren't going away. In fact, in the past 12 years, there have been at least 10 separate disaster supplemental funding bills. We have all heard concerns about how long it takes funds to get out to those in need. The process is not only lengthy, but confusing for everyone involved. Currently, there are 72 active Federal Register notices going all the way back to 9/11, which grantees must navigate to determine how to design and implement their local programs. It is difficult to determine what applies or does not apply, and oftentimes grantees may be brand new or inexperienced, further complicating an already cumbersome process. We strongly recommend a permanent framework to bring transparency and efficiency to this program. We believe it will reduce the time between appropriation and disbursement and provide clarity around the requirements of the CDBG-DR program. We also hope any permanent authorization considers identifying core program activities more clearly. There is often a steep learning curve for new grantees, and adoptable core functions would mitigate the delay and mistakes in having each new grantee create its own disaster program. We believe that codifying even just the requirements for grantee action plans could trim 2 to 4 months off of this lengthy process. The OIG's work has demonstrated the need for strong internal controls. Our work has demonstrated that any grantee program should include good internal policies. It should include strong monitoring policies and procedures. It should include clear understanding of reporting responsibilities. It should include good financial management policies, procedures, and systems. It should include information systems that ensure accurate and timely reporting of receipts and expenses in HUD systems. It should include clear conflict of interest policies and procedures and training for all employees on conflict of interest. And it should include strong, proficient, written procurement policies and procedures. Our work has continued to highlight that CDBG-DR could and should provide a clear, unequivocal blueprint for all grantees to follow to meet expected strong internal controls. Finally, we have a concern regarding the late planning and expenditure of funds on projects, in some cases 5 or more years after the disaster occurred. Examples of this include sewer and infrastructure development on land where homes are never built, dredging projects for commercial shipping ports, a multi-million-dollar museum addition, among others. Then there's the question of unspent funds, sometimes more than a decade after a disaster, and whether we can reprogram those for a greater existing need today. I want to thank the committee for their work on this legislation. I thank you for being here today, and I look forward to your questions.
And we thank you as well for staying within the time frame. Let us move forward next to Ms. Mulligan McFadden.
Chairman Green, Ranking Member Barr, Chairman Waters, members of the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee, thank you so much for the opportunity to be here this morning to testify about the CDBG-DR program and offer my recommendations, which can shave months of needless delay from the time when Congress appropriates funding to when rebuilding begins. I'm Marian McFadden, the Senior Vice President for Public Policy and Senior Advisor for Resilience at Enterprise Community Partners. Enterprise is a nonprofit organization committed to making well-designed homes affordable. For more than 35 years, Enterprise has helped build capacity in both the public and private sector. We've invested more than $43 billion nationwide to produce or preserve homes in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and Puerto Rico. Enterprise has helped communities rebuild after disasters since Hurricane Katrina. Our current work in recovery and mitigation initiatives includes Texas, Florida, Louisiana, New York, California, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands. I worked on disaster recovery at HUD for more than 15 years, dating all the way back to the first multi-billion-dollar grant after 9/11, working as legal counsel for the CDBG program and Deputy Assistant Secretary for grant programs. I've worked in disaster-impacted communities all over the country, and one of my greatest frustrations is that the lessons learned in one disaster have to be relearned over and over in subsequent disasters. The federal government has not been quick enough in improving support for disaster survivors. I commend the members of this subcommittee for making it a priority today. This morning, I'll emphasize the importance of CDBG-DR to all kinds of communities, urban, suburban, and rural, and recommend opportunities for making the program more efficient and fair. As the frequency and intensity of natural disasters continue to grow, CDBG-DR is an increasingly important funding source for recovering communities. After catastrophes, CDBG-DR is the last available source of assistance for property owners whose insurance proceeds, FEMA grants, Small Business Administration homeowner loans, and other sources have been insufficient to repair their homes or get them to stable new housing. This CDBG-DR assistance prevents families from entering years of financial hardship and distress. CDBG-DR is particularly valuable because it allows and requires states and localities to rebuild stronger and safer, helping to move households out of harm's way and ensuring existing and new housing is more resilient to future disasters. Mitigation measures more than pay for themselves, saving an average of $6 in future disaster recovery costs for every dollar spent on mitigation. I'd like to take a moment to highlight two major challenges with the CDBG-DR program. First, the time it takes for HUD funds to reach communities after a disaster, and second, ensuring grant funds reach the people who are most in need. The disaster component of the CDBG program, as you well know, lacks standing authority. This means that HUD must write new Federal Register notices after each appropriation, and shockingly, unlike permanently authorized FEMA and Small Business Administration disaster programs, HUD's multi-billion-dollar CDBG disaster program has never gone through notice and comment rulemaking. The public has never once been invited to offer comments on HUD's rules for disaster recovery. It's time to bring transparency to the post-disaster rulemaking process. Once HUD issues its temporary rules, it's typically more than a year before HUD programs begin serving families. Meanwhile, disaster survivors wait, often in unsafe housing, in hotels, doubled up with other families, or worse. While reducing the time it takes to rebuild housing and infrastructure is challenging, codifying CDBG-DR will reduce bureaucratic delay in moving resources from Congress to impacted communities. In addition to improving the speed of the program, I ask that you make changes to ensure that disaster funds serve the people who are hardest hit. It's often said that storms, tornadoes, and fires are equal opportunity, causing damage regardless of race or income. However, anyone who's worked in disaster recovery knows that that's not the full picture. Low-income people are more likely to live in areas that are physically vulnerable, where land costs are lower, and they're more likely to live in poor quality buildings, which are less stable in the high winds of hurricanes or tornadoes. Disaster recovery programs have too often prioritized homeowners over renters, who are more likely to be lower income and people of color. HUD's largest fair housing settlement resulted from New Jersey's failure to fairly balance Hurricane Sandy recovery resources among apartment buildings, mobile homes, and single-family homes, and to communicate the availability of resources to people of limited English proficiency. By engaging in a comprehensive process to make CDBG-DR a standing program, Congress and HUD can focus on ensuring that this never happens again. In conclusion, CDBG-DR provides a quarter of the nation's disaster recovery funds, and its permanent authorization would allow HUD to take steps to eliminate the months of unnecessary delay resulting from the makeshift structure. Rulemaking will also increase protections against fraud, waste, and abuse. I look forward to working together to better protect safety and property in communities, resulting in fair outcomes for the most vulnerable households and ensuring that the taxpayer dollars are invested with the future in mind. Thank you.
Thank you for your testimony as well, all of you. Mr. Ranking Member, without objection, persons who are members of the full committee but not members of the subcommittee will be allowed to participate in this hearing today. So ordered. Let us start now with the chair. I shall consume 5 minutes, and I would like to start with Mr. Kirkland. Mr. Kirkland, is it true that you have, or someone associated with your agency, has communicated with HUD, and HUD has indicated that it has some concerns with the codification and standardization of these rules?
As part of our audit on codification, they did communicate back to us that they did not see the need for codification as part of that audit.
And you have indicated in your testimony today that you clearly believe that there is a need for transparency and codification. Is this correct?
Yes, sir. Over the course of the time of all of these Federal Register notices, we have identified 59 either direct duplications or very similar Federal Registers across all of these disasters. We certainly see an ability to codify a program as part of that.
And if we don't have HUD as the entity that will step forward and take this affirmative action to codify and provide the transparency, then of course it does fall upon Congress. Obviously, Congress could step in at any time, but Congress is the court of last resort, as it were, with reference to these issues.
I would agree with that, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I greatly appreciate what you've given us by way of testimony and encouragement to go forward with these issues. Let me go next to the 3 members of the panel who are remaining. I would like for you, notwithstanding all that you have shared with us, and you have given us some salient points, but I'd like for each of you to give me one point, one thing that you think is preeminent in your thinking with reference to the legislation that we should consider. And I'll start with Ms. McFadden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to start with a very practical point, which is to make any real improvement in this program, HUD must devote more employees to its administration. Mr. Kirkland mentioned 72 active grants dating all the way back to 9/11. Those grants all have to have grant managers, and currently there are less than 24 full-time permanent staff working on disaster recovery at HUD. So in order to really get HUD to put its muscle into improving the program, we just need to take more load off the individual public servants.
Thank you very much. Mr. Secretary, you will be next, but before you testify, let me just assure you, I did visit Puerto Rico and had an opportunity to visit one of the hospitals. I saw up close the need that exists, talked to many people associated with NGOs and the government, and concluded that we have to do more to help Puerto Rico. With that said, would you kindly give us your one outstanding point?
Sure, and thank you, Mr. Green, for that, and thank you for the visit. And my point will be like standardization, though, that the rules for a grantee be the same to anyone, that we can standardize procurement, standardize pre-approved housing programs, and standardize data coordination, and especially damage assessment, which varies between agencies from SBA, FEMA, to CDBG-DR. And that will give us like a greater scope into that sense. So I concur with Ms. McFadden too, in terms of like the employment, and I urge you to provide more staffing to HUD in that sense, or funding for it so they can have more staff.
Thank you very much. Ms. Lamel, you're from my home state and the very county that I happen to represent. Can you kindly give us your most important point?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. The point would be that in any codification of CDBG-DR, that similar to the regular CDBG program, that direct allocations be made to large communities or urban cities and counties that have capacity to administer such programs. That would also reduce the time frame. In the case of Harris County, we have a long history of grant agreements directly with HUD to carry out such programs, and that would be greatly beneficial to our residents and our local ability to recover quickly.
Thank you. One of the things that we seek to do in the bill is provide some direct funding to the entities that are capable of managing the resources appropriately. Mr. Kirkland has indicated that there is a lot of concern for this, and I assure you, Mr. Kirkland, we take this admonition seriously. We will work to this end. But to all of you, let me just share this thought. This is an important day for us because it provides us an opportunity to make a difference in the lives of people who are still suffering. I thank you for your testimony, and I shall now yield 5 minutes to the ranking member, having stayed within my time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Kirkland, the IG's office has released dozens of reports with details about waste, fraud, and abuse within the CDBG DR program. Obviously, our committee is trying to balance the needs of people waiting for disaster relief against the taxpayers' interest in ensuring that the program has proper controls in place to prevent waste, fraud, and abuse. Your office has found a series of cases where disaster recovery money was not used for its intended purpose, and those cases do make clear that there's room for improvement with respect to the program. Earlier, I referenced multiple cases in which your office uncovered millions of dollars that were misused or went missing. These demonstrate a concerning trend that suggests a lack of oversight over these funds. How does HUD currently track disaster recovery funds to prevent waste, fraud, and abuse?
They do have a system that currently tracks the money as it is expended. I do know that HUD has communicated to us an intention to track that money more in real time than they have traditionally been able to do. I think they are working on upgrading their systems. As I pointed out in my testimony, I think it's very important that as we work with all of the grantees, as HUD works with all of the grantees, to ensure that all of those systems work together in collaboration so the grantees and HUD can have insight into what's being spent.
My understanding is that the secretary can waive program requirements so long as he or she finds, quote, good cause to do so. Is that a weakness in the program?
We have expressed consistent concerns on the ability and the waiver process. We have seen and certainly understand there is a need for waiver in certain circumstances, but we have seen that abused in many circumstances. Some of the circumstances that you pointed out, other situations where the waiver process, multiple waiver processes were used to basically allow for the expenditure of the funds in any way, ultimately, that
Whether or not it has anything connected to do with the natural disaster.
whether or not it had anything to do with the disaster.
And are waivers ever granted retroactively?
There are waivers granted retroactively.
And that, to
all the
me,
time.
is a big concern, because if you don't get pre-approval, you just spend the money however you see fit, whether it's connected to disaster recovery or not, and then you seek, permission after the fact, or forgiveness, perhaps, as opposed to permission in advance. I think that obviously is something that needs to be addressed in the legislation. How would codifying the program help HUD and your office make sure that the money goes to where it's supposed to go?
As we've noted, the concern that we see is that in every disaster, we basically reinvent the whole process. That seems a very inefficient approach. As we've noted, there are a lot of consistencies across all disasters, and finding ways to efficiently approach that. And ultimately, the goal is to get the money to the people who need it most, and that is not being achieved by this inefficient process.
We've heard a lot about the pace of fund delivery and the slow pace of fund delivery. That is a problem, because obviously if vulnerable victims of disasters are not getting their relief in a timely manner, it's not much help. In fact, many of the people affected by the 2017 disaster still haven't seen a single dollar from HUD in most cases. Is that unusual, or does it typically take 2+ years to even see the first dollar?
The circumstances of this disaster have taken significantly longer than prior disasters. As we've noted, typically the first Federal Register notices go out in about 35 to 45 days. That's a necessary time, but that's the typical time that it takes. In this case, I think it took about 154 days.
Codification and rulemaking under a permanent program would expedite that, preventing that Federal Register.
That is correct.
Notice. And then Ms. Lamel's argument about direct assistance, is that, I mean, obviously Houston is a sophisticated jurisdiction. Is that the right approach?
So obviously, we've had experience with, like New York City did get a direct allocation of disaster relief. The internal controls are the important aspect from the work that we've done, ensuring that those are in place. Whoever gets the money, I think those are the important things.
My time has expired. Thank you.
Chair now yields 5 minutes to the chair of the full committee, Ms. Waters.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman and members. I want to just find out from you, Mr. Kirkland, if you know what's happening in California. We've had the Thompson fires, the Woolsey fires, the Camp fires, and I understand that there's some problem with OMB that may be holding up the process for rules. Do you know what is going on with California?
I do not know specifically whether OMB is holding up that. We can certainly check into that and get back to you on that. We have expressed and do have concerns that there may not be the level of expertise to understand how to respond from a disaster front as it comes to fires, just because we have experienced many natural disasters, but maybe from the standpoint of the expertise available, understanding how to respond to a natural disaster that is a fire. Anecdotally, we've had some concerns there. We don't have any specific work on that, but that's a concern that we've expressed.
Well, I want you to know that it was unfortunate, but we were not able to get the California Department of Housing and Community Development representative here today, Mr. Ben Metcalf, but he did send a statement, and I ask unanimous consent that it be included in the record, Mr. Green.
Without objection.
Thank you very much. Let me just ask you, because I've heard a lot about Puerto Rico, and we're all concerned about Puerto Rico. We're concerned that perhaps Puerto Rico has not been assisted in the way that it should be assisted. Is there any interference in getting that assistance to Puerto Rico from any part of government? We know that we heard about HUD. We heard that HUD is not staffed properly, that, they're basically not doing the job that they should be doing. Is there any interference from the White House?
So we've obviously received a request from members of Congress to look into that interference. We are in the process of looking into whether or not there has been any interference and do plan to report back to Congress on what we find.
How long is it going to take you?
We will expeditiously do so. I know that our folks are out there right now doing that, and we do intend to get back as soon as possible.
When was it started? When was your investigation into this issue first started?
I believe we received the request during the shutdown, and so our review of it started right after the shutdown.
Well, it's been over a year and a half since Hurricane Maria devastated Puerto Rico, resulted in billions of dollars of destruction and thousands of hurricane-related deaths. In response, Congress appropriated $20 billion in disaster recovery grants to help Puerto Rico rebuild and protect against future disasters. To date, again, HUD has only made a fraction of this money available to Puerto Rico. As the HUD IG, you said you're looking into what has been happening and whether or not there was interference. Tell me how your investigation is framed. Are you looking into whether or not there has been interference, or are you just looking at HUD and its inability to do its job?
The questions raised to us did relate to the total of what you've asked about. Obviously, we may have some limitations on our jurisdictional ability to look into the totality of that, but where we can, we have asked those questions that Congress asked us to get to the bottom of.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Thank you, Madam Chair. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Posey. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and we thank the witnesses for your appearance and your testimony today. Mr. Kirkland, as noted, the Green-Wagner bill lays out some very general activities to be authorized by a codified CDBG DR program. The HUD Inspector General concluded that the agency already has sufficient authority to codify the program. I assume that means you believe the existing statutes provide some clarity about which kinds of activities to fund and which kinds probably should not be funded. Has the IG's audit of the program developed a set of principles for deciding when a CDBG grant would be duplicate of other federal programs? And if so, could you give us some examples?
So obviously, we are concerned that more progress has not been made on coordination and collaboration between the agencies that are responsible for putting out disaster relief, specifically FEMA, SBA, and HUD. We do think there needs to be additional collaboration to ensure that relief is being provided in whatever form necessary, but that also the agencies are coordinating and collaborating on that front. We don't think that's being done enough, and then obviously Congress did pass some legislation directing that to be addressed last year. We don't know that a lot of progress has been made on that front, though.
Okay, thank you very much for that great answer. Ms. McFadden, your testimony runs counter to the direction of the Green-Wagner bill with respect to duplication of agency programs. As noted, the Green-Wagner bill would prohibit using funds for flood hazard mitigation work that can be done under the National Flood Insurance Program already, or FEMA programs. You recommend that reform explicitly state that eligible hazard mitigation projects include all activities permitted in FEMA's hazard mitigation grant program and pre-disaster mitigation program. Could you explain why that would be the right way to proceed with this program as opposed to adequately and consistently funding such work underneath the FEMA rather than supplanting those efforts with the HUD money?
Thank you for the question, and I certainly am not in favor of duplicating any funding that's already being provided for the same purpose, but CDBG DR is often used by communities to wrap around existing FEMA funds. So communities often do not get sufficient FEMA dollars to complete the mitigation projects that are necessary, and generally the CDBG DR funding is coming later in time, and so it can fill those gaps.
Do the other members of the panel agree with that answer? Mr. Kirkland?
We do feel that our work has demonstrated that duplication of benefits, we think that is a policy call for obviously Congress working together with HUD and the other agencies to decide. We do think, though, that the agencies need to make sure they coordinate and collaborate whatever decision they make.
Okay. Mr. Secretary, you care to weigh in on that?
I definitely concur, and I think the expertise is a key to it, and HUD should be focusing on housing, for example. If it's energy, it should go to the Department of Energy. If it's related to infrastructure, it can be DOT or the related agency, the Corps of Engineers, and that way we'll definitely eliminate the duplication of benefits because each area will be handled by a single entity with the expertise.
Okay. Ms. Lamel, your response?
I would just add that, yeah, there needs to be closer coordination between FEMA and HUD programming. I would just caution that funding to FEMA for mitigation, we need to make sure we're looking at the cost-benefit analysis and ensuring that is equally and fairly being distributed across all of the residents if we're going to go that route. FEMA historically has looked at, especially in the hazard mitigation program, has looked at cost-benefit that in our community has benefited those more wealthier and higher income areas. CDBG DR has always been used to help those communities that otherwise would not receive assistance from FEMA.
Okay. Well, thank you for your answers. I see my time's up. I yield back. Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, sir. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from New York, Ms. Velasquez.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Gill, or Mr. Hill, Secretary Hill, in announcing the most recent award of $82 billion, HUD also announced that it will require financial controls on this new tranche. What has HUD communicated to you about those fiscal controls, and how will the controls impact your action plans?
Well, nice to see you, and thank you for the question, Ms. Velasquez and Congresswoman Velasquez. But, I mean, HUD pre-approved our fiscal and internal controls before actually approving the action plan. Afterwards, they have been working shoulder to shoulder with us to strengthen like some of the controls that we have and based on best practice. Last week, for example, Mr. Irv Dennis, the CFO, with a delegation, probably like 15 people from HUD office were there at the Puerto Rico Department of Housing, just to go and see like the whole system work and the implementation process into it. You know, and based on previous stories and previous remarks from last year, I believe that HUD also is taking like a corrective action plan in terms of like waste money from more than 20 years. And I think Mr. Kirkland or the OIG did a hearing in which they established that between the Department of Defense and HUD, there was like a $21 trillion missed in more than 20 years. And well, I can see that they're taking more direct control into it, so they don't waste taxpayer money. And if that's the case, then I mean, like, I'm all for it. I'm all for controls. I'm all for compliance. But that communication has to be faster and has to be quicker in that sense in order for us to implement faster.
Thank you. Mr. Kirtland, I, together with Benny Thompson and Raul Grijalba, Natural Resources, Homeland Security, and I'm the chair of the Small Business Committee, we sent to you, or to Helen Albert, a letter, January 17, asking for an investigation regarding the fact that there were reports that Deputy Secretary Pamela Patenute has resigned due to disagreements, in part over this administration directives to interfere with the release of Puerto Rico disaster relief funds. And this is disturbing, yet you are saying that have you opened the investigation?
We are currently looking into the request, and we have currently.
Are you going to depose Deputy Secretary Pamela Patenute?
We are taking active steps to look into all of the information that was provided to us, and we do intend to report back the results of that.
Do you understand that this is an important issue for 3.4 million Americans in Puerto Rico whose lives are at risk given the vulnerability of the infrastructure, whether at the hospital, the power grid, and yet if we have an administration that is obsessed with the fact that Puerto Ricans, American citizens, are not deserving of our help.
We absolutely see the importance of that.
This is about life and death.
In December of 2017, I had the great honor of going down to Puerto Rico and seeing for myself the extreme devastation that occurred on that island and the impact that it had on those 3.4 million people. I experienced a tropical cyclone when I was in American Samoa, and I know the absolute vulnerability that living on an island following that type of devastation can bring, and I can assure you we are taking those allegations very seriously.
Well, I expect that because yesterday, the Washington Post reported that at an Oval Office meeting on February 22nd, we sent this letter January 17, Trump asked top advisors for ways to limit federal support from going to Puerto Rico, believing it is taking money that should be going to the mainland, according to senior administration officials. So this is disgraceful. It's a disgraceful way to treat United citizens who have made so many contributions to this country. My uncle served in the Korean War. We owed the people of Puerto Rico an explanation. Enough is enough.
Gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Michigan, Ms. Talib.
Thank you, Chairman. Good morning to all of you. Detroit area, or city of Detroit, was rated, I think, one of the 5 least likely cities to have a natural disaster. However, in 2014, several cities in Michigan and Metro Detroit area were impacted by major unexpected flood, meaning that any city at any point could be impacted by natural disaster. It's important to make that note. Disaster relief has been inequitably distributed amongst people of different races, ethnicities, economic classes, and I'm so glad that we talk about home ownership statuses, meaning renters versus homeowners. According to Fair Housing Act, recipients of federal housing funds are required to, quote, and I'm learning what the interpretation of this is affirmatively further fair housing. This requirement means that state and local governments must use disaster recovery grants to take meaningful actions to overcome historic patterns of segregation, promote fair housing choice, and foster inclusive communities that are free from discrimination. Disaster recovery funds have shown to be incredibly hard for people with the greatest needs, as some of you have testified, including low-income renters, people with disabilities, and people experiencing homelessness to relatively higher income homeowners. Ms. McFadden, how can HUD, and I'm asking you because, and I'm new here, Chairman, but I call HUD, we call all the liaisons for various departments, and HUD liaison doesn't call us back. I just want to put that on record. The only department that doesn't call me back. How can HUD ensure that communities are rebuilt in a way that actively deconstructs racial housing segregation and promotes accessible housing opportunities for people with disabilities?
Thank you for the question, Congresswoman. CDBG disaster recovery funds only show up in communities when there's been catastrophic devastation. So the silver lining, and I don't mean that disrespectfully, but the silver lining that comes with the award of CDBG DR funds is the opportunity to fix mistakes of the past. So that includes when rebuilding housing, thinking about where low-income housing was located and the lessons that we've learned about the impact on children's lives, of what it means to grow up in a segregated low-income area versus a more robust community of opportunity. So one opportunity there is to locate new affordable housing in communities of opportunity. And another issue that I would highlight is the impact on homeless people. So there's a misconception that people who were homeless before the disaster aren't really impacted because they didn't lose a home. But the reality is that people who were struggling to maintain their daily lives before the disaster have compounded traumas after going through catastrophic events, and are often really in hard times after FEMA rejects the ability to serve them permanently. And so one recommendation I have there would be to direct HUD to work more closely with the homeless office inside of HUD, as well as to direct the recipients of funding to work closely with the community of continuum of care, providers of homeless assistance.
And historically, what, as members of Congress and those folks, we can direct various states to do certain things in various departments, but what are some of the things we can do in accountability, right? What are specific, do we hold that money? What are some specific actions that we could take to push this really important, I think, element as part of trying to really address natural disasters and the impact on low, especially renters and homeless, our homeless neighbors and our disabled residents?
I agree. Oversight is a critical function of the federal government, and after making more strides in setting up the recipients of funding for success, they need to come on the backside and look at the data. The numbers won't lie. Let's take a look at who the programs are serving by income, by race, by housing type, and look at that against the data on where the need was the greatest based on where the disaster struck.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, all of you, for your testimony and your advocacy today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield my time.
Thank you. The gentlelady yields back. The chair now recognizes Mr. Stivers, 4 or 5 minutes. Style. Pardon my incorrect statement.
I appreciate you coming in to testify. Mr. Kirkland, I understand there were concerns about whether disaster recovery funds were equitably distributed and whether a community is rich or poor, urban or rural. It should be able to get the same help it needs from a disaster recovery standpoint. As we debate codifying this program, what can we do to ensure that future distributions have a positive impact on all communities? Can you just comment on that, please?
I do think it's incumbent on CDBG-DR to work with the grantee to identify what the needs are. But I think once those needs are identified, our concern has been you see sort of a moving target from the standpoint of, are you really addressing the needs that were originally identified? And the waiver process is obviously a concern of ours. We do recognize there needs to be flexibility in ensuring that certain requirements can be waived for particular disasters and the like, but using the waiver process to allow anything and everything to change is I think, a dangerous position to be in.
Thank you. Ms. McFadden, in your testimony, you suggested requiring grantees to develop mitigation plans that anticipate future likely disasters and form the basis for proposed projects. Can you give an example of where that's been successfully done, maybe on a voluntary basis? Have you seen that play out?
Well, one example I would cite would be through HUD's Rebuild by Design competition. So after Hurricane Sandy, HUD worked closely with philanthropy, the private sector, and cities, counties, and states that were impacted by Hurricane Sandy to come up with comprehensive plans for protecting their communities, looking not just at what it would take to make them physically safe, but also how they could use the opportunity to achieve multiple benefits from the serious infrastructure investments that would be made.
Thank you. I appreciate your time here, and I've learned a lot from today's discussion. I yield back my time.
Thank you. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Missouri, Ms. Wagner, who has been a great partner to work with on this legislation.
I thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank the witnesses for being here. Mr. Kirkland, in 2018, the HUD OIG released an audit entitled HUD's Office of Block Grant Assistance had not codified the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program. In that report, the IG's office laid out reasons why it is so important to codify the CDBG-DR program. Did you work on that audit, sir?
Our office worked with the Office of Audit. At the time, I was the acting Deputy Inspector General, so obviously I worked directly with the audit staff that was working on that.
Wonderful. Can you summarize why you think codifying the program would lead to better outcomes, please?
So as we noted as part of that audit, we identified 59 either direct duplications or similarities.
59?
59 in the Federal Register notices associated with the disasters over the years. That type of commonality seems to point to a consistency of approach. However, the failure to take advantage of a consistency in approach leaves these grantees in a position that they can't act until HUD acts. They have to wait for HUD to do something first, and that delay is absolutely unnecessary.
So those who need the assistance the fastest are delayed by year, 2 years, depending upon how long it takes to set up. I know the purpose of using CDBG funds for disaster recovery is to help the most vulnerable people and businesses take care of needs that were not met by other disaster relief programs. But in most cases, those people and businesses have to wait years for CDBG-DR money to reach their community. The people affected by the 2017 disasters, as has probably been stated, still haven't seen a single dollar from HUD in most cases. And I was there and I voted to appropriate this money. Mr. Kirkland, is that unusual, or does it typically take 1 to 2 years to disperse DR funds?
So there are always delays in the process, and as I noted in my testimony, even getting the action plan out is, action plan Federal Register notice out normally takes 2 to 4 months to do it. In this case, it took 154 days.
Mm-hmm.
So obviously a significantly longer time as part of these disasters. We do recognize that these were unprecedented
Right.
disasters, but we think that argues even more for codification.
And why, so why is the process so slow? Is it codification, or are there other things we can do to streamline this disaster relief funds?
Our understanding, obviously, this time around, well, part of it is understanding what the money is, and I think making sure, HUD goes through its processes. But as we noted in our audit report, a lot of those processes are, we believe, unnecessary.
What can we do to expedite the process so we can get these dollars to the people who really need the help rebuilding their lives?
I think you are well on your way in this bill that you all have introduced to creating a process that will streamline this.
Terrific, and that's great news, Mr. Chairman. One last question, Mr. Kirkland. What can Congress do to ensure CDBG DR funds aren't duplicating benefits already received? What can HUD do? For instance, how does HUD know whether SBA provided assistance already so that it does not necessarily duplicate funding?
I think we've continued to encourage HUD to work with the other agencies that do provide benefits to coordinate their efforts to ensure that they're communicating. I do think that ensuring that as part of this bill, there is a dictate for sharing of information between state, local, federal agencies to ensure there's transparency in that process for everyone involved, I think would be a good aspect.
And I thank you for that testimony, Mr. Kirkland, because I couldn't agree more. FEMA has to be speaking with SBA, with HUD, with the state and local. Everyone needs to be coordinating so that we can get the proper assistance to those in need in the fastest manner forward. Codifying this program, making sure that these organizations are working together is key, along with the clawback provisions to make sure, too, that this money isn't lingering out there in the billions of dollars for years and years and years. So I thank you all, the witnesses. I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for your tremendous work on this. I thank my friend Andy Barr, who is the ranking member of O&I, for taking this mantle up also. I yield back.
Thank the lady for her kind comments. The chair now recognizes the gentlewoman from Harris County, Houston, Texas, Ms. Garcia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I too want to thank you for bringing attention to this very critical issue. As you and I both know that Texas and, of course, Houston, Harris County has had more than its share of incidents that we've had to wrestle with, as was stated earlier by one of the witnesses, in the last 10 years. So first, I want to thank you for having this hearing, and I know that as well as everyone knows, as well as I do, that there's just been shocking devastation that Harvey has left, not only in Harris County, but most of the Gulf Coast region of Texas. And while our recovery from Harvey has been impressive, it is beyond frustrating that we sit here today, 578 days after Harvey made landfall, still trying to grapple with these recovery programs. While Harvey may have drowned Harris County in rain, it has almost been drowned in red tape. Both the federal and state government has piled on undue additional restrictions and delays. Now we must face the fact that a delayed recovery may become no recovery at all for many people, especially in my district. This committee has the opportunity to make sure that these holdups are not repeated with the next disaster, whether it be in Harris County or anywhere else in the country. And unfortunately, we all know there will be a next time, because there is always a next time. Let's learn from what we've heard here today so that we aren't back here after the next season of hurricanes, fires, or anything else in our country, asking again what happened. Mr. Chairman, again, I applaud you for working on this legislation, and I look forward to working with you to make sure that CDBG-DR is codified, and we thank you for your service on this important issue. And with this, I want to begin my questioning, and I have so many because for those who don't know me, I've been dealing directly with many of these incidents in Harris County for many, many years, either as city controller in Houston, watching the dollars and how the CDBG dollars have been spent, or as a Harris County commissioner, wrestling with recovery. So, Ms. Lamel, I want to start with you. You and I have worked together on many of these projects. It was really great to see you. I read your testimony. I really agree with everything you've mentioned. And you mentioned the thing that we've wrestled with for many, many times, which is the need for huge cities and cities that have the capacity to deal with these issues firsthand, particularly the spending and the accountability issues. Is that like the one thing that you wish got changed, was the being able to receive the direct grants, or is it pre-certification, or is it cutting some of the red tape? I mean, if you could tell us the one thing we really need to get done that would help you tomorrow, what would that be?
Thank you, Congresswoman Garcia, and I appreciate the question. The one thing is that direct allocation for Harris County and City of Houston would be beneficial and would cut a lot of the red tape. The other thing, as has already been mentioned, is that the permanently authorizing CDBG-DR would also allow that to happen, that if you have the rules, we could start our planning much earlier. We could start our planning immediately following a disaster, or even pre-disaster in the case of a hurricane that we know will be hitting us. We know what the rules are prior to a disaster, and having the codification of CDBG-DR would give us a lot of that. Under the regular CDBG program, we do that on an annual basis. We pre-identify up front. We go out to our community, work with our nonprofits.
Right, we've worked on
entities.
a lot of those together, but
Yes.
I guess my concern would be the concern, I forget, somebody else raised it. We know that Harris County can handle it. You know, you're equipped to do that, but I know that when I represented Houston as county commissioner, I also represented about 12 other municipalities around Houston, much smaller, who couldn't. So they went to Harris County for us to administer the program for them. How would we determine, or what threshold would we use to be able to say, Harris County, you get direct allocation, but maybe Austin you don't, or Boston you get it, but maybe Baltimore doesn't? I mean, what guidance would you give us on that?
I would say that any entity that receives CDBG-DR and is a direct grantee, they have the monitoring history. They also have a pre-history of OIG audits. We are regularly audited and we are reviewed. And I think capacity is shown via previous audits and ability to carry out these programs. HUD has a lot of the ways of looking at grantees already. I would say, and any ability to do that should be part of the review and capacity review to allow that to happen. In cases where a community does not have capacity or wishes not to be a direct grantee, you can always, give that to the state to administer if that is your choice. I think the choice should be for a community to lead its direction, and local ability to plan and carry out those activities are best for its residents.
Okay, Mr. Kirkland, very quickly, I was really puzzled with your response to the chairwoman regarding, I'm sorry. Well, I'll submit my question in writing. Thank you.
The chair will now recognize Mr. Loudermilk for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate the panel being here today, and from most of what I've seen and from testimony we've heard and questions, a lot of the inefficiencies and delays in grant funding come from what appears to be the front end and the back end of the entire process. And I know that a lot of my colleagues have already addressed the inefficiencies, delays because of lack of formal structure, and how codifying would benefit that. I want to look at the back end side of that and see what we can do there. Mr. Kirtland, on the back end, it seems that there's a lot of unspent funds that end up sitting into the coffers that could be used for other things, could be used in different areas. It seems to me that if we had an expiration date on the use of those funds, and if they're not utilized, they go back into the Treasury, it would be, one thing, a better use of taxpayer money, but also may incentivize those funds to be used more efficiently. What do you think about a 6-year timeline, or what are your thoughts about how to better improve that back-end process?
Obviously, we would want to lead the decision on the specific time frame to the policymakers on exactly how long that should be. Our experience, though, has been the longer you get out from a disaster, the more troublesome issues that we see in the expenditure of funds, the more creative ways that we see that grantees use to expend funds. The further you get out, the more problematic that is from our perspective. And obviously, we do think, and HUD, I think, has self-imposed a 6-year term, but then they consistently waive that 6-year term. You know, we do think a time limit should be set. We also recognize that there is money sitting out for many different disasters, long past, dating all the way back to 9/11, money still sitting in the coffers of those particular disaster recovery efforts.
So do you ever see that when money sits out there for a longer period of time, there may be, by some localities or jurisdictions, little creativity in how that money could be spent?
That is where we see the probably the most creativity of money being spent is the further you get out from a disaster.
So you got this pot of money that we've utilized what we could for the initial disaster relief, but there's still this pot of money that we need to figure out how we can use. Does that kind of summarize some of what we're?
Agreed.
And a time period would obviously resolve some of that.
Do agree, yes.
Okay, thank you. I'd also like to move on to the environmental review process, and I know, Ms. McFadden, you testified to that in your written remarks. What are some of the specific issues in the environmental review process that cause these back-end delays?
Well, I think if you ask any recipient their biggest headache with federal funding, they probably tell you environmental reviews.
Yeah.
So while it's absolutely good public policy to have standards to ensure that when you're making a federal investment in a property, it will, for example, do no harm to the environment or do no harm to people who are living in or using that building, after a disaster, some of the real pain points are when you're simply getting people back into their homes, but having to do long and expensive reviews on properties which don't yield any benefit at all.
What can be done to streamline that process?
So the last several appropriations have taken great steps to allow HUD recipients to adopt a FEMA environmental review that's been done. I think that's a terrific effort and would like to see some more loosening of the standards around rebuilding single-family and multifamily properties that are, where they were before the disaster.
While we're on the subject of environmental, because this kind of ties into it, I appreciate some of the things that you guys are looking at doing at flood risk mitigation. I think that's something that's been overlooked. I think that's something that we've looked at on this side in our National Flood Insurance Program reauthorization. And my understanding is that if we properly do some type of mitigation, especially moving people out of harm's way, it's a 6-to-1 savings for every $1 of federal funds spent saves $6. Can you give us an update on HUD's implementation of the CDBG-DR mitigation, and what are your recommendations?
Seeing short on time, I would say it's been more than a year since Congress provided the funds in February of last year, and Secretary Carson said recently that we could expect to see the rules for how to use that money in May. That's a call for codification and rulemaking right there, so that we never have to see that kind of delay between when you make the funding available and when recipients learn how it can even be used.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. The chair will now recognize the gentlewoman from Pennsylvania, Ms. Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for calling this hearing, and I thank those who've come to testify before us. We certainly know that in the last several years, especially this last year, our country has suffered tremendous losses and the need for disaster relief and the appropriate and prompt distribution of disaster relief is something we in Congress grapple with, and I thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the bill that you have crafted. I would like to, at this time, yield my time to Ms. Garcia.
Ms. Garcia is recognized.
I thank the gentlelady from Pennsylvania, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the additional time. And I was caught in the middle of asking you a question. I was really troubled with your responses to the chairwoman regarding the disaster recovery dollars for Puerto Rico. I mean, I've seen more than one report about the White House, either directly or indirectly through some of its agencies or some of its staff, asking for delays or different criteria and restrictions on Puerto Rico that have not been placed on other states. And you said you were looking at that, but your responses never seemed to tell us anything specific. I think you used the words, we're actively doing it, we're doing, what is going on and why is it taking you so long? Because it seems to me that for a group of people that are supposed to be reviewing the red tape to provide the efficiencies and the effectiveness that you're talking about, it seems like you're suffering from the same red tape.
We are making every effort to look into.
But what does that mean? What are you doing?
And that's including.
Because meanwhile, as my colleague from New York mentioned, meanwhile, there's people waiting in Puerto Rico. I mean, I went to Puerto Rico. I've seen it firsthand. Sure. There's more blue tarps than I wanted to count. I went to Ponce with the mayor. I visited in San Juan. I just was stunned at the lack of response. Your job is to review that and make sure that we know that it can happen quicker.
We are interviewing a number of folks. Obviously, some of those folks have since subsequently left HUD, so tracking those individuals down and going through the process of gathering information from those. We are working diligently to do so, and we will make every effort to get that done as quickly as possible.
So how many people do you have doing this as compared to any other review that you've done somewhere else, or are you doing less also, just as the president apparently, according to some reports, wants all the other agencies providing the relief in response?
The inquiry is a priority for us. We have dedicated a team of agents and attorneys that are working together to get the answers to those questions.
And what is your timeline for a response?
As soon as possible. We did get a report
tomorrow,
from that.
next month, next year. I mean, again, the people in Puerto Rico are waiting.
We are prioritizing that. We obviously never know where a particular inquiry will take us, so I hesitate to put a timeline on it, but I put every guarantee that our agency is providing every resource to ensure that we can get you the answers as quickly as possible.
Well, I join many of my colleagues who are concerned about this issue, particularly, Senator Velasquez and others, because, again, I know how audits works. I was controller. We did audits, and the key to an audit is to go in there and do it as quickly as possible that you can, as effectively and efficiently as you can, so that you can get the lessons learned and the things that need to be done to ensure that the dollars get where they need to go. And sir, we're sorry. If we could hurry it up, we would, because I do think that when you look at how some of the dollars have gone in the past, yes, it's always slow, but it just seems that with Puerto Rico, it's just damn slow, and we need to get it going. Thank you so much, and thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back my time.
Does the gentlelady, Ms. Dean, would you yield the final 24 seconds to me, please?
Absolutely, I yield.
Thank you. Mr. Kirkland, quickly, do you know the number of people in HUD who are working on the DR program? At one time, I'm told that we had but a handful of people.
So the last number that I heard obviously was between 20 and 25. The number I heard was 24.
24.
Permanent employees.
Thank you very much. Chair will now yield 5 minutes to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Zeldin.
Thank you to the chairman and the ranking member for yielding and for holding this hearing. I thank the witnesses for being here. And as I was listening to the last questions and comments, the two words that certainly ring true and really is the purpose of this hearing are the two words lessons learned. And my background's the Army. I've spent about 16 years or so between active and reserves. And I think one of the things that makes our military the greatest military in the world is our ability to learn lessons of what works well and what doesn't work well. I'll tell you from another perspective, which is more directly related to today's hearing, I'd like to speak as a Long Islander who went through Superstorm Sandy and to share a few thoughts with regards to lessons learned from that experience. I hope the chair doesn't mind just indulging me because it's personal for us on Long Island. At that time when so much was yielded to state and local governments to administer these programs for the federal government, very quickly there was a responsibility to staff up from 0 to 100 miles per hour. Not 0 to 100 staffers, it was hundreds of staffers, and it had to happen quickly. And there was a huge turnover with the staffing, changing of responsibilities. People would submit their paperwork and go several months not knowing that their paperwork was incomplete. And they just assumed that they had submitted everything because they never heard back. They decided to follow up 6 or 9 months later, and they're told, well, your paperwork's incomplete. Hear these stories from individuals, hear the stories from businesses, and that was a problem. Here's another problem. People finishing their entire casework, completing their packet where the government is telling them your paperwork is completed, and then not hearing anything for several months, and when you follow up, it turns out that the staffer who was working on your case had left, and the new staffer who's assigned to your case says, I have no documentation whatsoever, and you have to start all over. I believe that if our committee, the full committee, this House is able to draft legislation, learning lessons from some of those disasters most recently, I would just request that we go back even further at the chair and the full committee's indulgence to look at what went well and what didn't with the response to Superstorm Sandy. We have a lot of personal stories on Long Island. And I believe that we can never allow any other region of our country to experience what we did, what we went through on the east end of Long Island. I don't know if any of the witnesses have any perspective from that component with the lessons learned, but I do have a couple minutes, so please, remaining my time, so feel free.
Yes, Congressman, I would just add in Harris County, we've learned lessons. We saw some of that after Hurricane Ike, which was 2008, and we are prepared for this with Harvey. We understand our residents, and I constantly tell our team that we have to, even if it's difficult for our staff in the office, if it's difficult for us, we're looking at making it easier for the applicant and keeping them informed. That is a high priority for us in Texas. We understand many of our folks have gone through 3 floods in the last 3 years. And so we are very sensitive to that, and we keep constant communication, and we've set up a program where we're constantly giving folks a way to call us. We reach out to them, but we have lived that experience, and we understand our residents, and we're staffing for that.
Congressman, I have a perspective to add. I served on the President's Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force as Chief Operating Officer and later Acting Executive Director. And I would say one of the innovations that came from the Sandy work was the repayment of work that homeowners did before they entered the program, so allowing them to be reimbursed for work they did themselves, rather than telling everyone, you have to wait till our contractor can come to you. And that's something that HUD has continued to permit and should continue to be permitted, so that those homeowners who have the ability to go out and hire their own contractors or do the work themselves don't have to stop and wait for their turn.
That is a hugely important lesson learned. I could certainly echo just thousands of examples from Long Island on that point.
I'm just gonna mention something quick, and it's between all the places that CDBG-DR has been implemented. HUD has always been paying the same IT system or the same kind of controls into it, and I think like HUD should have like an IT system just dedicated to it and to all the grantees And in that sense, they can see real time where the expenditure, who was served and who was not, and they don't have that. So it's something that is must be done.
Thank you. My time's up. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair will now, with the consent of the ranking member, accord the ranking member and the chair 3 additional minutes, for questions and/or comments. Mr. Ranking Member, you're recognized for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Again, thank you for holding this hearing. Thank you to the witnesses for their testimony, and I would ask unanimous consent that our statements about today's hearing that occurred prior to the gavel be included in the hearing record. No objection? Thank you.
Without objection.
Thank you. A couple final questions for Mr. Kirkland on procurement standards. Procurement standards apply to most HUD programs except for this, except for CDBG-DR. Based on your office's audits of the current program, what are the risks of not using procurement standards when dealing with disaster relief contractors?
We are absolutely perplexed by not having consistent procurement standards. Obviously, that lack of consistency creates amazing risks associated with fraud, waste, abuse. That is open for being taken advantage of. We will note that FEMA requires standard procurement standards, so we're not quite sure why HUD cannot.
I've heard some anecdotal stories of big problems with this program, with the lack of procurement standards, and I urge the chairman and Ms. Wagner to address that in their legislation if it's not already. Final question. We've heard a lot about Puerto Rico today, so let me just ask you, Mr. Kirkland. In November 2017, your office issued a report that identified a number of concerns regarding Puerto Rico's newly created Office of Socioeconomic and Community Development Policy. This is the office that's charged with administering Puerto Rico's CDBG?
It is not currently. I think one of...
Secretary's is now, right?
The Secretary's is now, correct.
But was it before?
So that was initially one of the major concerns immediately after the disaster was even identifying who the potential grantee would be. I do think there was some confusion in the time right after the disaster in concluding who the grantee would be. But at that time, that was the entity that was identified to us as the most likely grantee.
And
but
so,
obviously that's
and one of your chief concerns at the time was that office staff consisted mostly of former employees from its predecessor, which had a track record of mismanaging HUD funds.
that is correct.
Okay, and so obviously we have a new administrator now. But the point is that there were some concerns initially with who was going to be administering some of these HUD dollars.
That is correct.
And that could be a contributing factor to wanting some additional assurances that we have program integrity now in the administration. And Mr. Secretary, thank you for what you're doing and working with HUD to make sure that the dollars are not just getting to the people of Puerto Rico in a timely way, but with integrity so that the taxpayers are that there's not waste, fraud, and abuse in the process.
Accountability and transparency.
I yield back, and I thank you for your time.
Thank the ranking member as well. I will now yield 3 minutes to myself. Mr. Kirkland, would you please address the staffing at HUD because of this enormous amount of money and the limited staffing? Can you give us some indication as to how you think the staffing impacts the process?
We obviously have concerns with the current staffing in CDBG-DR. I think the 24 permanent staff within HUD that oversee this, I think they oversee over $1 billion each in their portfolio.
Was that million or billion?
$1 billion.
Okay.
And 1.9 billion, I think, to be exact. $43 billion total overseen by 24 HUD employees. Compare that to HUD's overall budget for everything else of $54 billion overseen by 7,500 employees. Does seem a bit desperate.
Well, I thank you very much. Let me move now to my closing comments. I had the opportunity to visit Puerto Rico, and I did visit with the governor. I met with mayors and I met with persons who were part of NGOs, visited various facilities in the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, I must add, the Commonwealth, where all of the persons are citizens of the United States of America. So these are our people, and I understand the passion associated with what's happening there after having made my visit. And I want to just give an assurance that we do want to do all that we can. And I'm speaking for myself, I suppose, and those who agree with me. So when I say we, I and all who agree with me, we want to do all that we can to be of assistance to the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, simply because of the need that exists and the fact that these are American citizens. So I thank you for your testimony, each of you, for your testimony. And I would like to indicate that the, excuse me just a moment, make sure I'm on my right page. Okay, witnesses, for devoting your time and resources so that we could share your expertise. I would also like to note that additional questions may be posed to you, and that the record will remain open for 5 legislative days for members to submit these written questions. And finally, without objection, members will have 5 legislative days to submit extraneous materials to the chair for inclusion of the record. I do thank all of you, and I will now adjourn the first hearing of the subcommittee for this Congress.